The crowd at Willow Creek's Saturday market split like cattle before a rider. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Just as Ruby Lane stumbled backward, one hand clutching her rounded belly, the other groping for anything to stop her fall. A gruff trader had shoved past without so much as a glance, sending her off balance and teetering on the dusty wooden walk. Then a strong hand caught her arm. Another braced gently at her back. "Stand beside me," a deep voice said, steady and calm, like the earth beneath boots. Ruby looked up startled and saw the clearest blue eyes she'd ever met, weathered by sun and time under the brim of a worn-out Stetson. It was the year 1876, out in the Montana Territory, and Ruby Lane was 5 months along alone, and a long way from anything that ever felt like home. "Thank you, sir," she breathed, voice almost lost in the market noise. She smoothed the wrinkles of her calico dress, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "No need for thanks, ma'am. Some folks round here need a lesson in common decency," the man replied, eyes narrowing as he followed the retreating back of the trader. "Name's Jack Coulter," he added, tipping his hat. "Most folks just call me Jack." "Ruby Lane," she answered, finding her breath again. "I appreciate the help, Mr. Coulter." Jack gave a small nod, his gaze softening as it dropped briefly to her belly. "You shouldn't be out here alone in your condition, Miss Lane. Market days get rough, what with all the drovers in town." Her fingers twisted at the wedding band on her hand. "Don't have much of a choice," she said quiet. "And it's just Miss Lane now." Something flickered in his eyes. Out here, a woman on her own didn't have many roads left to walk, and fewer still when she was carrying a child. "Well then, Miss Lane," Jack said, extending an arm in an old-fashioned gesture that felt oddly out of place in the dust and commotion. "If you'd allow it, I'd be honored to help with your shopping. No lady should have to wrestle this crowd alone." Ruby hesitated. She'd learned the hard way that kindness from strangers often came with a price. But there was something steady in his voice, something unhurried in his eyes. She slipped her hand through his offered arm. "I don't want to be a burden," she said cautiously. "Ain't a burden at all," he replied, adjusting his hat with a smile. "I came for supplies myself. 2 hands carry more than one." As they moved between the vendors, Ruby noticed how folks stepped aside when Jack passed. Not because he was big, but because something about him held weight. His clothes were plain but clean. A faded blue shirt under a leather vest, denim trousers tucked into worn boots, a sidearm at his hip that looked like it had seen its share of trouble, but wasn't meant to show off. "You're new in town," he remarked, as she inspected a pile of late-season potatoes. "Got here last month," she said, testing for firmness. "I'm staying at Nora Carver's boarding house until—" Her voice faded, her hand brushing her belly again. She didn't finish the thought. She didn't have to. Nora's good folk. "Fair rates keeps the place clean," Jack said. Ruby nodded. She's been kind, though she didn't mention her dwindling coin purse, or how many nights she lay awake wondering how far her luck would stretch. "You live in town, Mr. Coulter. Got a small ranch 5 miles east," he said, bagging her potatoes with practiced ease. "Ain't much, but I built it up from nothing over the past 8 years. Just me and a couple hired hands running cattle." As they moved to the next stall, Jack carried her things, tucking them into his saddlebags without question. He told her about arriving in Montana after the war, working his way up from nothing, buying a patch of land and holding tight to it. "And you, Miss Lane?" he asked, as she ran her hand over a bolt of cotton, calculating the cost of a baby's layette. "What brought you this far west? I was headed to Oregon," she said, keeping her tone light. "Got a cousin there. But the road turned rougher than I figured." He didn't press, and she was thankful for it. The truth was too heavy for a market conversation. Eli Lane's death by fever back in Missouri, the debt collectors who circled like buzzards, the stagecoach crash that left her stranded in Willow Creek. Too much to tell a stranger, no matter how kind. "Funny thing about life," Jack said. "Sometimes the places we end up weren't ever part of the plan, but maybe they're where we belong." By the time they finished, the sun had dropped low, throwing long shadows across Main Street. His chestnut gelding stood patiently at the hitching post, dust crusted on its legs. "Thank you for today," Ruby said, clutching her smaller bundles as Jack tied the rest to his saddle. "My pleasure, Miss Lane," he replied, then paused. "Would you mind some company on the way back to Mrs. Carver's?" The walk was short, but Ruby found herself slowing her steps, not quite ready to let the moment slip away. Jack kept pace, chatting easily about the town, the weather, the way winter had a habit of creeping in early around these parts. His voice had a calmness to it, no puffed-up talk or empty boasting, like so many others she'd met. At the boarding house steps, Ruby turned toward him, suddenly shy. "You've been very kind to a stranger, Mr. Coulter." Jack removed his hat. "Out here, we help each other. That's how we get by." He passed her the last parcel. Their fingers touched for half a breath. "Miss Lane," he said, "I come into town most Saturdays. If you ever need help again, I'd be glad to lend a hand." There was something in his voice, not pushy, not demanding, just solid. Ruby found herself nodding. "Thank you. Maybe I will." As he rode off, she stood watching until his figure blurred into the dusk. A flutter moved beneath her ribs, the baby kicking. "Well, little one," she whispered, hand resting on her belly. "Looks like we've made our first friend in this dusty old town." The next Saturday, Ruby caught herself scanning the street for that chestnut horse. She told herself it was practical. A pregnant woman had plenty to carry, but when she spotted the familiar figure outside the general store, her heart leapt in a way that had nothing to do with potatoes or fabric. This time it didn't feel like coincidence. Jack's smile was warm, steady, and when they fell into conversation again, it was easy, like something old being remembered. They talked of winter coming, of firewood, and baby quilts, of what still needed doing on his ranch house. And somehow, standing shoulder to shoulder beneath the fading sun, Ruby Lane no longer felt quite so alone in the world. "I've taken on some work helping Nora Carver with the cooking and cleaning," Ruby told Jack, as they stood by a shelf stacked high with jars of preserves. "It's not much, but it keeps a roof over my head, and food on the table." "Smart move," Jack said with a low chuckle. "If you don't mind me saying, Nora's biscuits could use a touch of magic." Ruby laughed, a sound that surprised her, even as it left her lips. "I've already started tinkering with her recipes." The other boarders seemed mighty grateful. As October bled into November, their Saturdays became a rhythm neither of them questioned. Jack would carry her parcels, walk her back through the biting wind, and their talk grew deeper each week. Ruby learned of his family back east, parents gone, a sister named Abigail Everett in Boston he rarely saw. And Jack came to understand the sorrow that had driven her west. Eli Lane was a dreamer. Ruby confided one bright, cold afternoon as they sat on a bench outside the Mercantile. Always certain the next venture would strike gold. He wasn't a bad man, just restless. "And you?" Jack asked, watching a swirl of red leaves chase down the street. "Were you a dreamer too? I reckon I was practical enough for both of us." She sighed. "Someone had to be, but I loved him for those dreams even when they crumbled." She paused, eyes fixed on the street. "When the fever took him, I thought I might go under too." Jack's hand shifted toward hers, then drew back. "Grief runs on its own clock," he said softly. "Can't rush it." On the first Saturday in December, Jack didn't show at the usual time. Ruby lingered at the general store, watching snow spit from a gray sky. By noon, she gave up, scolding herself for feeling disappointed. "Miss Lane," The call came just as she gathered her parcels. Jack rode up his gelding's flanks, lathered from hard travel. "Sorry I'm late. One of my hands, Roy Cutter, broke his leg. I couldn't leave till Dr. Silas Pike came out." Relief swept through her, then something else she had missed him truly. "Is your man all right?" she asked, noticing as Jack swung down stiffly from the saddle. "Doc says he'll mend, though he's laid up all winter." Jack pulled off his gloves, reddened knuckles raw from cold. "Leaves just two of us to run everything." "You're hurt," Ruby said, catching the way he favored his side. "Just sore," he shrugged. "Horse spooked in the commotion and I hit the ground. Nothing broken. But as they walked, she saw the tension around his eyes. When a gust knifed down the street and made him wince, she made up her mind. "Mr. Coulter, Jack, come back with me to the boarding house. Let me fix you something hot before you ride home in this weather." He opened his mouth to decline, then nodded. "That's mighty kind. Truth be told, a moment by a warm fire sounds good." Nora Carver raised an eyebrow when Ruby ushered Jack into the kitchen, but said nothing beyond a polite greeting. In the 6 weeks since their first meeting, Ruby had never invited him inside, holding tight to the propriety expected of a woman in her situation. Jack sat at the table, shoulders hunched. Ruby heated water for coffee and set out biscuits from that morning's baking. The simple domesticity of it, this big man at her kitchen table, felt strangely natural. "Your hands need tending," she said, sliding a mug toward him and pulling up a chair. Without waiting, she took his rough palm, studying the scraped knuckles. "It's nothing." He started, but fell silent under her stern look. "I've spent my life patching up men too stubborn to admit they're hurt," she said, reaching for a tin of salve. "My father came home from carpentry every week with just a scratch." Jack submitted quietly as she cleaned his cuts with carbolic and worked in the ointment with careful fingers. "You've got a healer's touch," he murmured. "Just practice," she replied, though his words warmed her. Eli was forever getting nicked on some project or other. When she finished his hands, she hesitated. "Where else are you hurt? And don't tell me nowhere I can see it plain." For a heartbeat, he looked ready to deny it, then sighed. "Ribs are sore. Met a fence post on the way down." "Let me see," Ruby said, then blushed at her own boldness. "It's all right," Jack assured her. "I trust your judgment." He unbuttoned vest and shirt just enough to show the purpling bruise along his side. Ruby studied it with clinical calm, though her heart hammered at the intimacy. Bruised, not broken, she pronounced grateful, her voice held steady. "But you'll need it wrapped if you're short-handed." As she bound his ribs with strips of clean cloth, she became acutely aware of his closeness, the lean strength under her fingers, the scent of leather pine and honest sweat. When she finished, their eyes met. Something unspoken passed between them. "Thank you," Jack said, voice rougher than usual. He buttoned his shirt, breaking the moment. "You'll make a fine mother with hands like that." The word mother snapped her back. She was 7 months along with another man's child, a widow still wearing her band of gold. Whatever stirred between her and Jack Coulter had no rightful place. "You should rest before riding home," she said, turning to wash her hands. "The storm's getting worse." Jack stayed another hour talking quietly while snow piled up outside. When he finally rose, Nora Carver appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Coulter," she said firmly, "I can't in good conscience let you ride out into this blizzard. There's an empty room and your horse can take the small stable out back." Jack looked to the window at the swirling white and nodded. "That's mighty generous, ma'am. I'd be grateful to accept." "That's mighty generous of you, Mrs. Carver. I'd be thankful to accept." That night, with Jack Coulter staying just down the hall in the guest room, Ruby Lane found herself wide awake, unable to quiet the thoughts racing through her head. The baby stirred restlessly, kicking against her ribs like it could feel her turmoil. She laid both hands on her belly, feeling the strong little limbs shifting beneath her skin. "What am I doing?" she whispered into the stillness of the dark room. "Your father's been gone less than a year, and here I am." She couldn't bring herself to say the rest aloud. What was she thinking? Catching feelings for a man she'd barely known 6 weeks, imagining a future that until recently had seemed forever out of reach. Outside, the storm howled. For 2 full days, it trapped Jack at the boarding house. In that time, Ruby watched him with the other boarders, 2 gray-haired sisters, May Hollis, the school teacher, and Seth Carver from the bank. Jack was gracious and soft-spoken, always lending a hand without being asked, sharing tales from his ranch that even made the usually stiff Miss Hollis crack a smile. When the storm finally broke on the 3rd morning, Willow Creek lay buried under 3 feet of snow. After breakfast, Jack prepared to ride out, anxious about his cattle and about Roy Cutter, the injured hand he'd left back at the ranch. "I'm grateful for your kindness, Mrs. Carver," he said, settling his tab at the front desk. Then turning to Ruby, "And thank you, Miss Lane, for patching me up. My ribs are feeling a whole lot better." She walked with him to the stable, where Jed Carver had brushed down his chestnut-gelding steam rising from its nostrils in the winter sun. The snow sparkled all around them, clean and blinding. Jack turned to her eyes, locked onto hers, with a look that made her breath snag in her throat. "Ruby," he said, her given name for the first time. "If it's all right by you, I'd like to come callin'. Properly, I mean." There was no room for misunderstanding in his voice. He wasn't offering more neighborly help or polite conversation. He was asking for a place in her life. "Jack, She gestured helplessly toward her rounded belly. "I'm not exactly, I know," he said, gently cutting her off. "I know you're still healing, still trying to find your footing. I'm not asking for promises, just the chance to know you better." His honesty caught her off guard. "Folks will talk?" she warned, half smiling. "Let 'em," Jack said, eyes crinkling at the corners. "In towns like this, gossip's the only entertainment come winter." Despite herself, Ruby laughed. "All right then, Mr. Coulter. You may call on me, though I don't know what Nora'll say. She already gave me her blessing," he admitted with a sheepish grin. "Asked her yesterday. Wanted to do things proper." The revelation stunned Ruby. Nora Carver hadn't said a word, though. Ruby remembered the quiet, knowing glances she'd received the past couple days. As Jack swung into the saddle, he gave her one last look, warm and solid as the sun rising behind him. "I'll be back Saturday, weather allowing." "I'll be looking forward to it," Ruby replied, surprised to realize she meant it with her whole heart. And sure enough, Jack returned that Saturday, even with the roads still iced over and treacherous. He came bearing small gifts, a jar of honey from his own hives, a hand-carved rattle for the baby, and most precious of all, a letter from her cousin Clara Whitlow in Oregon, which he'd picked up from the post. "She says she's still expectin' me come spring," Ruby told him, after reading it aloud in Nora's parlor, where the older woman kept herself busy in the next room. "Says she and her husband have space for me and the baby." Jack listened, hat turning slowly in his hands. "Oregon's good land from what I hear," he said evenly. Ruby nodded. "Yeah, but the more I think on it, the harder that journey sounds. With a newborn and mountain passes still frozen, maybe summer would be wiser." A flicker of hope sparked in Jack's eyes. "That's a sensible plan. Winter travel's rough even for the toughest man, let alone a mother with an infant." As Christmas drew near, Jack became a fixture at the boarding house. No longer waiting for market days, he'd stop by with news from town, borrowed books from Miss Hollis, and once even a sprig of holly he'd picked off a frozen fence post back at his ranch. They spent long hours talking by the fire about the places they'd been, books they loved, and futures they hadn't dared imagine. "Never figured I'd marry Jack," confessed one quiet evening, boots propped by the hearth. "Spent so many years fixin' up that ranch didn't seem worth complicating. But now—" Ruby's words escaped before she could stop them. And now Jack's gaze held hers without wavering. "Now I reckon a house don't mean much without the right people inside it." On Christmas Eve, the boarding house filled with laughter music and the smell of pies fresh from the oven. Ruby, 8 months along and waddling more than walking, had baked all day. When Jack arrived with brown paper packages under his arm, her heart lifted just seeing him. "You've outdone yourself," he said, surveying the spread. "Folks'll be talking about Nora Carver's feast for a long while, though I reckon we both know who really deserves the credit." Later, when the crowd thinned and candles burned low, Jack pulled her aside. "Got something for you," he said, handing her a small, carefully wrapped parcel. "Merry Christmas." Inside, nestled in a soft handkerchief, was a silver locket strung on a slender chain. Simple. Beautiful. "Jack, I can't accept this," she said, fingers brushing the delicate engraving. "Please," he said softly. "It was my mother's. Been saving it all these years, waiting for the right person." Ruby felt the weight of what he was offering, not just a gift, but something sacred. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "May I?" he asked. When she nodded, he stepped behind her, gently fastening the clasp. His fingers grazed her neck, and a shiver ran down her spine that had nothing to do with the cold. When he stepped around to face her again, there was tenderness in his expression, but uncertainty too. "Ruby," he began, then faltered. She waited, heart pounding, suddenly aware of the sprig of mistletoe hanging above them, a festive touch from Nora, no doubt. Jack's eyes flicked up to it. "I don't want to presume," he said softly. But Ruby had already made up her mind. She rose on tiptoe and pressed a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Merry Christmas, Jack Coulter," Ruby Lane whispered. The way his face lit up made the risk worth it, worth the stares, the whispers worth all the doubts she hadn't yet named. He gently took her hand and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, his voice thick with feeling. "Merry Christmas, Ruby Lane." 2 mornings after Christmas, just before dawn, sharp pains tore Ruby from sleep. The baby coming early. Nora Carver didn't waste time. She sent young Seth Carver racing into town for Dr. Silas Pike, while May Hollis stoked the fire and boiled water. As Ruby groaned through another contraction, clutching the bedsheets, Nora leaned close. "Should we send word to Mr. Coulter?" Ruby shook her head, breath ragged. "No. The snow, the roads." Another contraction sliced through her, stealing the words. But Nora had already decided. When Dr. Pike arrived, he found Nora giving orders to another boy. "Ride to the Coulter Ranch," she said briskly. "Tell him Miss Lane's time has come." The labor stretched on through the day, each hour pulling more strength from Ruby's trembling body. As dusk fell across snow-blanketed Willow Creek, her strength wavered. Dr. Pike frowned deeply, trading glances with Nora. "The baby's turned wrong," he admitted at last. "If things don't change, I'll have to intervene." Ruby barely heard him. She floated in and out, her world narrowed to waves of pain and gasping breaths. Somewhere in that fog, she thought she heard Jack's voice, but surely it was her mind playing tricks. Until it wasn't. Suddenly, he was there at her side, kneeling beside the bed, his face pale with worry. "I'm here, Ruby," he said, his voice steady, though his eyes betrayed fear. "Right here with you." She blinked, unsure if he was real. "Jack, you shouldn't be here. It's not proper." "To hell with proper," he said fiercely. "I'm not leaving you." And she believed him. When Dr. Pike called for her to push, Jack supported her with strong arms and quiet encouragement never letting go. She held on to his voice, his presence like a lifeline in a storm. Then, after what felt like an eternity, the room filled with the sharp cry of new life. "And a girl doctor," Pike announced, wrapping the squirming infant in soft cloth. Small, but strong. They laid the child in Ruby's arms, a red-faced, dark-haired baby with a firm chin and a spark already in her eyes. Ruby looked up at Jack, who stood watching them both, tears brimming in his eyes. "She's beautiful," he said hoarsely, "just like her mama." Ruby, exhausted and raw, didn't hide what she felt. "Thank you for coming. I needed you." Jack brushed her hair back gently, hand warm on her forehead. "Wild horses couldn't have kept me away." She named the baby Maggie Lane after her own mother, a name that whispered of hope and strength. For the next week, Jack came by, daily arms full of firewood or bread or little things the baby might need. He did what Nora allowed a man to do in a house full of women, and Ruby began to depend on his knock at the door. On the 8th day, with snow falling steady outside, Jack showed up carrying something long wrapped in burlap. "I figured the little one ought to have her own place to sleep," he said, setting it beside Ruby's bed. She peeled back the wrap and gasped. It was a handcrafted cradle-smooth pine carved with care. "You made this?" Jack nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. "Started it on Christmas night. Was nearly finished when word came you were in labor." Ruby gently placed Maggie inside. The baby curled into the bedding Nora had sewn, utterly content. When she looked up, Jack's eyes were on her, not the baby. "Ruby," he said, taking her hands. "I know it's soon. I know you're still healing, still finding your feet. But I can't hold this in any longer." Tears filled her eyes even before he said the words. "I love you," Jack said simply. "I think I've loved you since the market that day when you stood there all alone, but held your ground. I love your heart, your grit. And I love this little girl like she was my own." He sank to one knee, still holding her hands. "I'm not asking for an answer today, but I'm asking if you'll consider becoming my wife when you're ready." Ruby's tears spilled freely now. "Jack, are you sure, taking on another man's child, a widow with nothing? You have everything," he said, cutting her off gently. "You've got courage, Grace, and more strength than most men I know. That's worth more than land or gold." He squeezed her hands. "I'm not here to replace Eli Lane, but I'd be proud to raise Maggie and be there for both of you every single day." She looked from Jack to her daughter, then back again. She thought of cold nights alone after Eli's death, of dusty roads of fear and silence, and of the quiet joy that had crept into her life since Jack Coulter stepped into it. "Yes," she said, her voice steady. "Yes, I'll marry you, not someday, as soon as Maggie and I are strong enough to come home to your ranch." The look on Jack's face, relief, joy, reverence, was worth any gossip that might follow. He kissed her hands slowly, reverently. "You won't regret it, I swear." Nora Carver wasn't surprised by the engagement. "I knew the day he caught you at that market," she said with a soft smile. "Some things are just meant to be." The town, of course, had opinions. Some folks praised Jack for his decency. Others whispered about the timing about Ruby's situation. One Sunday after service, Hannah Boone pulled Ruby aside. "Are you sure, dear? So soon after childbirth?" Ruby met her eyes without flinching. "With all due respect, Mrs. Boone, I've been alone long enough to know when I've met a good man, and I don't plan to let him walk away because someone else thinks it's too soon." Jack didn't seem to hear the talk or didn't care. His days were spent preparing the ranch for the arrival of a wife and child. He hired a woman from town to clean every corner of the house, ordered new furniture and supplies from Denver, and cleared a space in his life for two people who had changed everything. "The place ain't much," Jack warned Ruby during one of his visits. "Just 4 rooms and a lean-to kitchen. But the roof holds tight in a storm, and come spring there's room to build on." "It sounds just right," Ruby smiled. "All Maggie and I need is a warm place to start over." By early February, Ruby had healed enough from childbirth to consider the move out to Jack's ranch. Maggie was thriving, chubby-cheeked and fierce-willed, already showing signs of her mama's grit. "You sure about this?" Nora Carver asked, folding a baby blanket as she helped Ruby pack her few belongings. "Ain't no shame in waiting till spring thaws the road." "I'm sure," Ruby said firmly. "We're not rushing into marriage. Jack's fixed up the spare room for Maggie and me. We won't be sharing a roof like man and wife until after the wedding." That had been Jack's idea, a nod to decency, giving Ruby time to settle before taking his name. Reverend Amos Hart agreed to marry them come late March, giving the town some time to catch its breath about the match. On a bright but bitter morning, Jack pulled up in a wagon lined with blankets and warm bricks. Nora fussed over Maggie, bundling her tightly while the other boarders hoisted trunks with cheerful chatter. "You gave me more than shelter," Ruby whispered as she hugged Nora goodbye. "You gave me a fresh chance at something real." "You earned it, sweetheart," Nora said, patting her cheek. "Now go turn that ranch into a real home." The 5-mile trip to Coulter Ranch took nearly 2 hours over snow-packed roads. Jack drove slow, glancing often to be sure Ruby and Maggie stayed warm beneath the heavy quilts. As they crested the last rise, Jack pointed toward a snug log house nestled at the edge of a pine grove, smoke curling from the chimney. "There she is," he said softly. "Home." Ruby took in the sight, the solid house with its stone base, a weathered barn and corral beyond cattle, dotting the snowy pasture. It wasn't grand, but it was honest, and built with care. "It's lovely," she murmured, and meant it. Jack's hands, Roy Cutter and young Jed Carver, had prepared the place for their arrival. Inside it was warm. A stew bubbled on the stove. A jar of dried wildflowers brightened the table. "Don't fret about chores," Roy said, tipping his hat. "We got it covered tonight. You just see to your ladies." As promised, Jack had set up a cozy bedroom for Ruby and Maggie. The cradle sat beside a small window. Curtains hung a bit askew, matched the patchwork quilt on the bed. "Hope it's to your liking," Jack said, watching as Ruby glanced around. Mrs. McGraw helped pick the fabrics. "I wouldn't know a lace doily if it bit me." Ruby smiled, her heart aching a little. "It's perfect, Jack." That first evening, once Maggie had been fed and tucked into her cradle, Ruby and Jack sat in front of the fire. The wind howled outside, snow tapping at the windows. Inside, there was peace, warmth, something close to joy. "You happy?" Jack asked, reaching across to take her hand. Ruby nodded, eyes shining. A year ago, she'd been widowed and lost, drifting west with nothing but grief and a baby on the way. Now she was here, safe, wanted. "I never thought I'd feel this again," she whispered. "After Eli died, I thought that part of my heart was buried with him." "Life's funny like that," Jack said, brushing his thumb over her knuckles. "Takes what it wants, then gives you back something unexpected." As the weeks rolled on, Ruby found herself adjusting to ranch life with surprising ease. She was no stranger to hard work, and that grit served her well. She cared for Maggie, kept the stove hot, and slowly made the house feel like hers. Evenings were spent beside Jack, talking, dreaming. "I want to put in a garden come spring," she told him one night. "Maybe some flowers by the porch." "Whatever you want," he said. "This place could use a woman's touch. Been too long with just us fellas stomping through." As March neared and the snow began to melt in patches, wedding plans started taking shape. It would be small, Reverend Hart Nora Carver, the ranch hands, and a few town folks. Ruby found herself looking forward to it. The doubt that once clung to her about marrying again so soon faded in the quiet comfort of their everyday rhythm. One afternoon, while Maggie napped and Jack was out checking on the herd, Ruby wandered into the storage room just off the kitchen. Among crates and tools, she spotted a small trunk tucked away in shadow. Curious, she opened it. Inside, she found mementos, a woman's hairbrush, a faded daguerreotype of a young couple, some worn books, and at the bottom, a wedding dress carefully wrapped in muslin. She was smoothing the folds when Jack stepped into the kitchen snow on his boots. "I found this," she said, lifting the dress gently. "I wasn't snooping, I swear." Jack's face softened. "You weren't. That was my mother's. I've kept her things all these years. Wasn't even sure why." Ruby reverently folded the gown back in place. "She must have been special." "She was." Jack nodded, kneeling beside the trunk. "Lost her when I was 15. My pa didn't last long after, like he just gave up without her." He picked up the photo, holding it toward her. Their wedding day. He was 30. She 19. Ruby studied the solemn faces Jack's father, with his strong jaw, his mother with tender, expressive eyes. They looked proud, like they knew what they were getting into. "They did," Jack said, voice steady. They had their fights, sure. But the love, that was real. He returned the photograph to the trunk with care. "I always hoped I'd find a love like theirs," Ruby whispered, her eyes lingering on the fading photograph. The question hung in the stillness between them. Had they found that kind of love too? Jack reached for her hand, their fingers locking like puzzle pieces that had always belonged. "I think you already have," Ruby said softly, her gaze steady. "And so have I." Jack leaned in, and when his lips met hers, it wasn't just a kiss. It was a vow unspoken. Months of quiet moments, shared burdens, and growing affection, all sealed in that one tender gesture. When they finally parted, his eyes gleamed with emotion. "I've been meaning to ask," he said almost sheepishly. "Would you want to wear my mama's wedding dress? It might need some adjusting, but..." Ruby felt her heart bloom. "Jack, I'd be honored. Truly." Their wedding day dawned crisp and bright, the kind of spring morning that whispered of second chances. Nora Carver came early, her arms full of fresh wildflowers and greenhouse blooms, and a smile that lit up the room. "You're a vision, Ruby," she said, pinning the last curl into place, "and Jack Coulter is one lucky man." The silk gown yellowed with time, but graceful in every stitch, hugged Ruby's figure with quiet dignity. It needed only a few alterations after childbirth, but it felt like it had waited for her all along. The ceremony was small, heartfelt. Little Maggie Lane, dressed in a hand-stitched gown made from Ruby's own wedding handkerchief, slept peacefully in Nora's arms throughout. Reverend Amos Hart spoke of grace, of starting over, of love, forged not in fairy tales, but in fire. Jack's voice was steady as he took her hands. "I, Jack Coulter, take you, Ruby Lane, to be my lawfully wedded wife. I promise to love you, protect you, raise Maggie as my own, and build a home that stands through storm and sun. Where you go, I'll follow. Your kin are my kin. This I vow before God and all here today." Ruby, blinking back tears, answered with quiet strength. "I, Ruby Lane, take you, Jack Coulter, to be my husband. I promise to stand beside you, to make our house a home, and to walk with you through every season. Your joys are my joys. Your burdens I'll carry too. This I vow before God and these witnesses." Reverend Hart smiled as he declared, "By the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. What God's joined, let no man break apart." Jack's kiss this time was sure and warm, drawing a few chuckles and misty eyes from Roy Cutter and Jed Carver. As they turned to face the small crowd, Ruby felt something she hadn't known in a long time: belonging. The celebration that followed was humble, but full of heart. Nora's cooking a simple cake from the town bakery, and a whole lot of laughter around the new dining table Jack had built himself. As evening shadows stretched long and the guests rode off, the newlyweds were finally alone. Jack stoked the fire, while Ruby nursed Maggie the moment intimate and beautifully ordinary. "Mrs. Coulter," Jack said with a grin as she returned from tucking Maggie in, "I reckon this is our first moment alone as husband and wife." Ruby smiled and melted into his arms. "Sure is, Mr. Coulter." Their kiss this time carried months of quiet longing, a deep knowing. When they finally parted breathless, Jack pressed his forehead to hers. "I'll never push, Ruby. We've got time. All the time in the world." But Ruby's hands cupped his face with certainty. "I'm not waiting. My heart's already home, Jack. I'm yours." Later that night, with moonlight draped across their bed, and the valley quiet except for a distant coyote's call, Ruby rested in Jack's arms, her head on his chest. "You happy?" he murmured, fingertips tracing her shoulder. "More than I ever thought I could be," she whispered. "Are you sure?" he asked, voice low. She kissed his skin, smiling. "Absolutely." Spring painted the Coulter Ranch with new life calves dotting the pastures, wildflowers along the creek, and rows of vegetables sprouting in Ruby's first garden. Maggie was growing fast, her eyes bright and curious hands, always reaching for the world. Ruby wrote to her cousin in Oregon, the letter ending with, "I found joy where I never expected. I hope you'll visit, meet Jack, and watch Maggie grow." When the reply came, Clara Whitlow wrote, "Sometimes life takes a turn for a reason. I'm so glad yours led you to love." As summer neared, Jack started hammering away at a house expansion, a proper kitchen, and a third bedroom. For the future, he told Ruby, grinning. Lord willing, Maggie might have some brothers and sisters. The thought filled Ruby with a deep peace. Watching Jack carry Maggie on his shoulders, singing lullabies in a voice only a father could get away with. She knew without doubt he'd be a good father to any child they were blessed with. One golden June evening, they sat on the porch watching the sun dip low behind the hills. Maggie was asleep in Ruby's arms when Jack turned to her. "I've been thinking," he said, "about that day at the market. If that fella hadn't shoved you aside, if I hadn't been right there, we might never have crossed paths," Ruby finished. Jack nodded, taking her hand. "Makes a man believe in fate." Ruby smiled, remembering that day, how scared she'd been, how that simple act of kindness had shifted everything. "Do you know what I thought when you said, 'stand beside me'?" she asked. "What I thought it was just a kind gesture," she said with a soft laugh. "I never imagined you meant it literally, that I'd one day stand beside you as your wife." Jack's smile lit up his whole face. "Maybe I didn't know it either, not at the time. But some part of me, it recognized you. You were the piece I didn't know I was missing." As night draped the Montana sky and stars began to peek through the cabin, sat quiet, wrapped in the hush of winter. 3 lives woven by fate choice, and maybe a touch of divine timing had become a family. 6 months later, on a crisp December morning, Ruby Lane stood by the kitchen window, watching the snow float down over the widened yard. In the corner stood the pine tree Jack and Jed Carver had hauled down from the hills, dressed in paper garlands and hand-carved ornaments Jack had whittled during long, quiet evenings. Little Maggie Lane, now a year old and brave on her wobbly feet, played on a quilt nearby, chattering to herself in delight. She had Jack's eyes. Ruby often thought, though, the dark hair and that stubborn little chin belonged to her birth father, Eli Lane. "Look at the snow," Maggie, Ruby called, scooping her up to the window. "Your first real Christmas snow." The baby pressed both hands to the glass, wide-eyed at the falling flakes. "Dada," she asked, her favorite word, and the clearest she had so far. "He'll be home soon." Ruby smiled, brushing Maggie's curls back. "Just headed to town for supplies." Almost like the little one summoned him, Jack Coulter came into view, guiding the wagon through the fresh white powder. Maggie squealed with glee, recognizing him even from afar. Ruby bundled her tight and stepped out onto the porch just as Jack jumped down from the wagon. His face lit up the way it always did when he saw them. "My girls," he grinned, sweeping Maggie into the air until she squealed, then leaning in to kiss Ruby like a man who never took love for granted. "Prettiest sights in the whole Montana Territory." "How are you feeling today, Mrs. Coulter?" he asked, his tone soft. "Better," Ruby said, resting her hand on her belly. "That morning sickness might finally be giving me a break." Jack's hand slid gently over hers, his eyes full of quiet awe. Their second child, the first they'd made together, was due early summer. The thought filled them both with a kind of still joy too big for words. "I brought something," he said, reaching into his coat pocket. "A little something early." He handed her a small, brown-wrapped bundle. Inside, nestled in soft cloth, was a silver charm shaped like a tiny baby shoe. "For the necklace," he said. "Next to the locket I gave you last Christmas." Ruby blinked hard against tears. "Oh, Jack, it's beautiful. Thought maybe we'd start a tradition," he said, bouncing Maggie on his hip. "One charm for each of our young'uns, to keep close to your heart." Ruby leaned into him, overwhelmed by the fullness of this life. "I love you, Jack Coulter," she said. "More than words'll ever cover." "And I love you, Ruby Lane Coulter," he replied, voice thick with feeling. "You and these babies born and still coming are the greatest gifts a man like me could ever dream of." The snow kept falling soft around them as they stood together, hearts bound by more than vows. Ruby thought back to the path that led her here, how one chance encounter in a noisy market had bloomed into everything she'd ever longed for. A family not born from blood, but from love. Maggie reached out with both hands, one touching her mama's cheek, the other her daddy's, like she knew she was the bridge between two hearts that had somehow found each other across life's hard miles. Jack chuckled, warm and low. "Smart little lady," he said, kissing her forehead. "She's got her priorities straight." Ruby couldn't speak. Her heart was too full, her throat too tight. She'd lost so much, walked through fire, feared the future. And yet here she stood, wrapped in love, with something bright and solid ahead. The Christmas lights on the porch blinked on as dusk began to fall, casting a soft golden glow around the home they'd built together. Jack's arm wrapped firm around Ruby's waist, grounding her in the here and now. "Stand beside me," he whispered those same words he'd offered in the market long ago. Always, she whispered back. And together they stepped across the threshold, not just into their cabin, but into the life and forever they'd promised each other. If this story has touched your heart, I invite you to stay with us to discover more true tales of the Wild West. Stories that honor resilience, tenderness, and the spirit that God placed in those who blazed the trail. Subscribe, share. Leave your thoughts in the comments, and join us once again to journey across this untamed land. Thank you